Good day, citizens of the free world, from border to border, coast to coast, and to all the ships at sea. I bring you a warm welcome. This is your correspondent, Jim Tate, and thank you for tuning in to the Tate Chronicles. Join me as we cut through the fog that exists at the leading edge of healthcare technology. Our mission, searching for beneficial disruption in healthcare from emerging technologies. I'm really excited today. My guest is Dr. Tom Giannulli. He's the founder of PatientDirected, which is a patient-directed health information, kind of from the grassroots up as opposed from top down. PatientDirected leverages blockchain and smart contracts to let patients share and monetize their healthcare data. So, Dr. Tom, good morning to you, and thanks for joining us, sir.
Thanks, Jim. Great to be here. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody.
First, let me just ask a general question. What problem is PatientDirected trying to solve?
Well, for those of you that may be practicing in the healthcare space or those that aren't, there is a well-known problem. It's called patient data interoperability. And the problem exists for the average patient when they try to move their data from patient A to Dr. A to Dr. B. They often find it very frustrating. They have to fax a lot of HIPAA requests and releases. They then have to coordinate the transfer of the information. Oftentimes, the information is incomplete. And sometimes it involves them physically going somewhere to pick up information and drop it off. I've had numerous conversations with people who find this to be completely ridiculous and outdated. And there is technology to solve that, has been deployed in a very broad sense. It's just not being utilized. And there has been no solution to date that actually puts the patient in charge. So we're trying to solve that problem, which is moving data around in healthcare for the patient's benefit. Secondary benefit of doing such a project is that patients then have the ability to control their information, since they now have a copy of it that they have in their own system, essentially through PatientDirected. They can then send it to any doctor or allow that data to be used for research, pharmaceutical industry use. And when that data is used or rented, in a sense, through our system, 90% of the revenues from that transaction go directly to the patient. And patients may not realize this, but their data is being rented, essentially, and sold without their knowledge or financial benefit every day. And so this really levels the playing field, lets patients gain control of their data, help arrange their data for their own use, and also help them monetize that data for their own benefit and help reduce their healthcare costs, which, as everyone knows, are going up 10 to 20% annually.
Tom, there's two big issues that you brought up there, so let's take them one at a time. In terms of interoperability, a lot of consulting work I do is with health information technology vendors. I've worked with over 300 of them. And so any certified EHR that's out there now has to have a patient portal. Now, so if you have a chronic condition or you're over a certain age, you probably have 4 or 5 or 6 different providers, meaning you have that many different portals. So it's impossible right now with those systems to aggregate that data. And so is PatientDirected a solution that helps you aggregate all that data from different portals, different providers? And how does it do it, Tom?
Yes, good question. So on a technical basis, yes, we do that. What PatientDirected represents to the patient is the one single true source of information on their medical record. So what we do is we ask you when you sign up, hey, pick from a list of every provider and healthcare location in the U.S. where you've seen providers or where you've seen care. And we use that information to then send them a message via fax and direct exchange for your healthcare information in digital form. And so every EHR, through the meaningful use legislation and project, has legislated that every EHR that's meaningfully use certified have this technology to communicate using direct messaging patient summaries. So we use that. We can also have the patient take their patient portal logins or take their patient portal data files and import them directly to PatientDirected. So the patient can help move the data into the system, and or we can just directly ask the providers for that information. The patient doesn't have to access their portals. Either way, we also take PDFs and fax uploads. Mm-hmm. So we actually have multiple ways to collect information. We then normalize that information into a common data model, and then we store that in what we call a distributed file system, which is a kind of a blockchain concept where you take a file and you shard it into, say, 50 different pieces, encrypt each piece differently, and distribute that piece into a different computer system on the node of the network. And so it's very hard for anyone to actually gain access to that information, assemble it, and decrypt it. Much safer than a centralized record system, which is how we do it today. So yes, we do. That is part of our function, is to actually organize the information from multiple sources, create a very high-quality data set that gives you longitudinal information and also couples it with things like your wearable device data so that you can have kind of a broader sense of the patient. And then the providers that get this information can take advantage of all that data if they need it. But at the same time, a lot of organizations want this information to manage the risk for incoming patients that they don't have incomplete information on. So it does help everybody in the picture. It helps the managed care and care provider networks. It helps the payers make sure that they get clean data on their claims and other past information. It also helps the patient make sure that there's no medical errors or inconsistencies.
You know, and I'm going to ask our listeners to be willing to allow us to get a little bit more technical because I'm fascinated by the technical aspects of this. Mm-hmm. So these for the 2015 edition certification requirements, which is the most recent CMS and Office of National Coordinator Certification edition, it's required for EHRs to have a API of some sort so that third-party applications with acceptable permissions really reach in and pull out data from the database of a particular provider's database. So that is a great kind of automatic way to get that data out. Another, and it comes straight out of the database. Another way involves patients who log into their portal and can download CCDAs. And bring those out or forward those. So through PatientDirected, are you able to use both those types of technologies and processes?
Yeah. So in the demonstration video, which is tied to the press release that you saw recently,
yes.
We demonstrated the use of the technology leveraging direct exchange. So
okay.
That was through kind of a messaging protocol that every EHR supports today. It is the most common denominator for all interactions electronically. If you step above that, yeah, there is a requirement for API. The API most likely will be FHIR. We do have a FHIR client built into our platform, so we can't communicate using FHIR. However, FHIR is not broadly deployed today, and
right.
You know, there is this question mark of, if you are qualified as a provider to access information, well, that's where they can get you. They can say, you need to go through 16 layers of paperwork before we approve you, and by the way, we don't approve everybody. So unlike direct, which is, hey, if you have a direct address, anyone who has a direct client can talk to that address. So I love FHIR. I think the API approach is great. However, I've seen historically in healthcare where you put together the technology stack and no one utilizes it for various reasons, and they tend to hold you up on this point of you're not consistent with our policies to access the data. So I'm a little fearful that may creep in. There's other protocols, care quality, Commonwealth, that we'd like to take advantage of, though they seem to be kind of dying at the moment. I'm not sure that they're really a growth technology at this point. I think they were bridging technology for a while. The technology that seems to be kind of overlapping this, at least in paper form today, is TEFCA. And TEFCA is the Trusted Exchange Network, network of networks topology that's being proposed in part of the Cures Act. And that will actually help us solve the problem in a bigger way if it ever gets implemented, funded, and deployed. So, three question marks there.
Yeah, and that's part of where we are. Just before we started the call, we were talking a little bit about the direction of a Hurricane Florence headed to the Carolinas, where I am right now. And the target or the path has to constantly be updated. So the potential paths and technical paths for interoperability, as you say, is kind of a question mark and changes over time. Okay. The last question I'd ask you and had to do with the fact that right now interoperability is attempted to be achieved by providers uploading data to a health information exchange. But what you've kind of turned that on its head and are having patients be the repository of their aggregated data. Is that a correct assumption?
Yes, that's correct. And I have to be honest with you, the HIE model has never really been successful. I have actually tried as a CMIO of a large EHR provider named Kareo that has over 40,000 providers to access various HIEs. And every time I've tried to access those HIEs, for some reason, I can't gain access. Maybe I'm not part of the funding members of that HIE, or possibly the fact that I have to go through a list of paperwork that takes a year and a half to get alignment.
Sure.
But the HIE model is basically failed. They're lacking any form of sustainable financing, and the whole TEFCA model is designed to basically intermediate them and take them out of play. So while I agree that the HIE model could have been successful, in the early days, it hasn't been, and I don't think that's a model we can rely on.
You know, it's the proof is in the pudding, and it's kind of interesting that the HIE's version 1 was what the RIOs, Regional Health Information Organizations, and the majority of them didn't last very long, and the whole process kind of rebranded as HIEs. And
yeah.
it does look like that plane is not really taking off the ground very well. So I would agree with you totally about that.
You know, it was actually called CHINs before it was called RIOs.
Oh, really? And what does that stand for?
Community Health Information Network. I mean, it's really the same wording, just spelled differently.
Yes. Yeah.
And the same failed business model does not work. So you can try it 3 times, it still doesn't work.
Well, the second thing that you brought up that I want to go into deeply is the ability of patients to monetize their data. Now, the data is being monetized. It's just that the patient or the consumer of healthcare is the only one who's not getting a piece of the coin, so to speak. So let's address that a little bit. Can you give me some examples of how patient data is currently being licensed or monetized by different organizations?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of HIE vendors and healthcare provider groups that are large, that have large data sets. And naturally, there's a high value to that data to, say, medical research, medical device companies, pharmaceutical companies, data analytics companies, big data companies. And they're all trying to get their hands on this data. There's several companies that have been formed to actually go in and act as a third party, go to the HIT vendors. We've had several approach me directly at Kareo for our data and offered us a payment for that data on a month-to-month or a per-use basis. And that information is basically de-identified patient data from our, massive patient database of, millions of patients. Now, at no time was there a patient release signed. At no time was the patient informed their data would be used in a de-identified manner, because there's kind of a gray area when it comes to who owns the data. If the data is in our system, do we have rights to it? Did we put that in our user contract when you signed it as a provider? Maybe, but was the patient made aware of that particular agreement? There's some gray areas within HIPAA around clinical research and de-identified data. So what I think we are doing is we're establishing the patient's side of that equation, giving them full transparency and access to that data, letting them have their natural rights expressed through their own data set. And I think eventually, much like GDPR in Europe, we're going to clarify very clearly that the patient is the only one that has ownership of this data and needs to be involved in that process. And once that becomes established, just like GDPR has been established in Europe, then our tool and our technology will be fundamental to any kind of data mobility and enterprise use of data. I think it's just early days, but I'd say 3 to 5 years you'll see this whole transition occur. And I think some of the social media companies like Facebook have kind of tipped their hat a little bit and saying, look, private companies managing your private data in ways that you do not benefit, and you actually they benefit financially and you don't. Those days are coming to an end, and healthcare is just one of those days. I hope those days are coming to an end. To me, one of the most obvious examples of monetization of
patient data or human data is in the field of the companies that do DNA testing and analysis. So you sign up for 23andMe or Ancestry.com, and you have your you pay your $80 or $100 or whatever it is, and you have your DNA analyzed. And in both of those cases, and probably in some other cases, that de-identified DNA data is licensed, and often to pharmaceutical companies. I know a recent case, 23andMe, SmithKline French, has done a partnership with them and put in over $300 million because they want to access that data for the development of pharmaceuticals.
That's a small example. That's one example of many, and that's a very visible one. It's a good one because that data is so important and is so personal. And then you have the consumer, on the other hand, who's paying 30% in some cases annually in terms of increased healthcare costs. It just doesn't make any sense.
Exactly. And so in patient-directed, and by the way, let me ask this, when can I sign up for patient-directed and have an account? When can I do that? How can I do it? What will it cost me?
I'm going to send you a link. It doesn't cost the consumer anything. It's free.
Okay.
In fact, when you sign up, you get 50 free tokens, which are useful on the network. And the reason we give you those tokens is because the HIPAA law today states that if you ask your doctor to send you some information on your medical chart electronically, there may be a small nuisance fee you have to pay the doctor. A lot of doctors don't charge that, but what we're going to do is go ahead and give that doctor one of your 50 tokens we gave you for free as an appreciation for them moving your electronic data. And by the way, anytime your doctor wants your information, your fresh copy of information to make medical decisions on, he will actually pay you one token. And so anytime a doctor signs up to our network, we give them 50 tokens as well. Now, if you think about it, it's kind of a neutral exchange, one token to look, one token to request. And the idea is just to mark it as a transaction and not really there's a ton of money based on a token moving around. But keep in mind that rate, which is one token for your own providers, goes up to about 1,000 tokens for, say, a pharma or medical device company who wants to look at your data.
Sure.
So we want to establish an economy on that data move.
Absolutely. And so you said you were going to send me the link. Is that a link available for anyone that's at your website? Can they go to your website?
Right now we're in pre-beta, so I'll only give it to a handful of people that
Okay.
Once we go into full release, which will be in January, then everyone can access. It's basically a link to a download of a mobile app.
Okay.
It's a simple mobile app.
And that link will be available sometime in January. It's expected at PatientDirected.io. Is that where it'll be? Okay, great. I want to touch just a little bit more about the patient data being licensed at both Ancestry and 23andMe. Patients or people who provide their DNA file there or have their DNA analyzed, they can opt out of having it licensed. But until this week, I didn't, and I've done these. I've had this done. I didn't realize until this week that I could opt out. So it certainly wasn't in my face that I could opt out. And I've heard that DNA. The average DNA has been licensed at 23andMe over 200 times. So there's certainly a lot flowing out there, and that's just one example of DNA. My healthcare data that I aggregate and keep at patient-directed, not only my health record, I'll be able to store my DNA data file there. Or are there plans to? Yeah,
so when it comes to DNA data, we can certainly store it. Other data sets that are much larger, say your MRIs, we prefer to refer to a location and use an API to pull that data as needed. For certain data sets that are really highly sensitive, we'd rather put in a biobank and leave it there, or data that's so enormous in its size and capacity that we'd rather not replicate it all over the internet or the network.
Sure.
And there's costs involved in doing that obviously on our end. So we like to leave that data in place and refer to it. So there's a combination of leaving data in place and pointing to it and having access to it using APIs, as well as a normalized and combined data set that can be easily accessed with 1 or 2 seconds of query. So both are pretty much in the topology or the architecture how we're going to have access to your massive data set.
And so users of PatientDirected, do they have to be in the U.S. or can they be anywhere globally?
It's a really good question. We really leverage HIPAA law. So HIPAA law not being outside the U.S., it's really not appropriate, and we probably don't have the, I would say, legal footing to probably do what we do in the U.S. I think we'll probably attack outside the U.S. as a secondary effort once we got the U.S. kind of figured out.
Sure.
And you've got GDPR in the European Union, which actually is like HIPAA on steroids, which would actually help us more than thwart us. But we really don't want to tackle that until we've got the U.S. Kind of figured out.
Sure. The blockchain platform that's being employed with PatientDirected, is it Ethereum? Is that what, or is it some other blockchain platform?
Right. So we looked at the technology stack pretty carefully. We started building. I wrote the white paper in January of 18, released it in January of 18, and at that point, Ethereum was the best platform on the market to run a blockchain. So a public blockchain. So looked at that carefully. Actually wrote a bunch of smart contracts on Ethereum, deployed them, realized that it's super slow and super expensive to run. Also found out that just the contracts themselves have so many weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Yes. Even if you get, say, $40,000 per contract audit, there's no guarantee your contract won't blow up, once it's deployed. And the way you revise contracts in Ethereum is really not very smart or very useful. So you kind of have dead contracts lasting forever out there. So we knew we could build it. We did build a kind of a rough prototype on Ethereum and use IPFS to store the data, but IPFS didn't have the built-in encryption and other things we needed. So we kept looking, wrote some of our own code, and realized that, there's a new project that was coming down the road called EOS, and it basically solved every shortcoming of every blockchain that came before it. And it was a marvelous design by some really smart people in the community. And they wanted to get it done in literally a year, which most people thought was impossible. But they did the impossible, and they actually released it earlier this year. And it works phenomenally. The best tool set I've used on blockchain. The smart contracts are extremely reliable. They're easy to code. It's a super fast network. There's a little bit of an issue with RAM costs, but aside from that, everything about the EOS blockchain platform to me is superior to anything else we've played with, including Hyperledger and other private blockchains. Enhancement of IPFS type model using third-party tools. One of them is called SIA or SIA. And there's another one called Filecoin that's on its way out the door soon. And Filecoin will probably become the standard we use going forward. But we could use multiple distributed file systems because they all have the same architecture, which is to shard, encrypt, and distribute, which is really important.
Yeah, scalability is critical, and that's so far kind of one of the weaknesses of Ethereum. Well, it's hard to believe, but our time is almost up. So I'm going to need to shut the door on our conversation, but I hope to continue it again before too long. And so I want to thank all the listeners for joining me on this episode of the Tate Chronicles. I offer a special salute to my guest, Dr. Tom Giannulli, and you can find more information on this show's program page at healthcarenowradio.com. Until we meet again, here's wishing you smooth sailing and safe harbors. And thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you. And just as a last-minute notice, the PatientDirected.io project is undergoing what they call an ICO, and you can actually buy shares of the company online as a non-qualified investor through the website. If you go to our website, you'll see a link to that ICO.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.